Settle in, let your breath slow, and allow yourself to drift back through time. Tonight, we're traveling to ancient Rome, not to the Forum with its noise and debates, not to the Colosseum with its crowds, but to a quieter place. A sacred place. A temple where flames never stopped burning, and where 6 women lived apart from the world, devoted to an eternal fire. These were the Vestal Virgins. Priestesses chosen as children. Keepers of Rome's most sacred flame. Bound by vows, protected by laws, and surrounded by mystery. Close your eyes now, and let us walk softly into their world. It begins with a letter. A small girl, perhaps 6 years old, perhaps 7, lives somewhere in the city of Rome. She plays with dolls made of clay. She helps her mother grind grain. She knows little of temples or priestesses or the weight of sacred duty. Then one day, a messenger arrives at her door. The Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome, has chosen her. Out of all the daughters of noble families, out of all the girls of the right age and lineage, she has been selected. Not for marriage. Not for motherhood. But for something else entirely. The law is ancient. It is careful. The girl must be between 6 and 10 years old. She must have both parents living. She must be free of any physical defect. Her father must be a citizen of Rome, preferably of patrician blood. And she must be without blemish, in body and in family reputation. The Pontifex Maximus performs a ritual called captio. He takes the girl by the hand. He speaks the formula, the same words spoken for centuries. I take you, Amata, to be a Vestal priestess, to perform the rites for the Roman people. And with that, her childhood ends. She does not return home that night. She does not sleep in her own bed. She is led instead to the Atrium Vestae, the house of the Vestals, a grand residence beside the Temple of Vesta in the very heart of the Forum. There, she meets the other priestesses. The elder Vestals, calm and composed, dressed in long white robes. The younger ones, perhaps only a few years older than herself, who remember what it felt like to be taken from home. She is given new clothes. A white woolen dress called a stola. A veil, also white, to cover her hair. A headband woven in an ancient style, tied in a way that only brides and Vestals wear. She is dressed like a bride, but she will never marry. That first night she lies in a small room with stone walls and a narrow bed. The house is quiet. Somewhere, perhaps in another room, the elder Vestals are praying. Somewhere nearby, the sacred fire is burning, always burning, never allowed to go out. And the girl closes her eyes, knowing that the next 30 years of her life have already been decided. She will serve for 10 years as a novice, learning the rituals. Then 10 years as a full priestess, performing the rites. Then 10 more as a teacher, guiding the younger girls. 30 years in total. 30 years of devotion. Only then, if she chooses, may she leave. May she marry. May she return to the world outside the temple walls. But for now, she is only a child. And the flame is waiting. In the stillness of that first night, the only sound is the crackling of fire in the distance, soft and eternal. The fire never goes out. This is the first rule. The most important rule. The fire in the temple of Vesta must burn always, day and night, summer and winter, in times of peace and times of war. If it goes out, Rome itself is in danger. The Romans believed this with absolute certainty. The flame was not just a symbol. It was a living connection to the gods. It was the hearth of the city, the heart of the state. As long as it burned, Rome was protected. If it flickered out, disaster would follow. And so the Vestals tended it with care that bordered on reverence. Every day, from before dawn until after dusk, at least one Vestal was always present in the temple. The building itself was round, shaped like an ancient hut, with a circular opening in the roof to let the smoke escape. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of burning wood and incense. The floor was polished marble. The walls were simple, unadorned. And in the center, the hearth. The fire was fed with specific types of wood. Oak mostly. Sometimes fruitwood, carefully selected. The Vestals used no metal tools to tend it. Metal was considered impure for this sacred task. Instead, they used wooden implements, passed down through generations of priestesses. They did not simply throw logs onto the flames. They prayed as they worked. They moved with ritual precision. They spoke the old words, the prayers in archaic Latin that even most Romans could no longer fully understand. And they watched. They watched for the color of the flames. They watched for the way the smoke rose. They watched for omens, for signs from the goddess Vesta herself. If the fire burned bright and steady, all was well. If it sputtered or smoked strangely, something was wrong. And if, gods forbid, it went out, then Rome held its breath. It happened, occasionally. A gust of wind through the temple door. A moment of inattention. A log that crumbled into ash before a new one was added. When the flame died, the entire city knew within hours. The Senate convened. The people whispered. And the Vestal responsible was brought before the Pontifex Maximus. She would be questioned. Examined. If it was determined that she had been careless, or worse, that she had broken her vow of chastity, and thus lost the goddess's favor, the punishment was severe. But most of the time, the flame burned on. The Vestals worked in shifts. They rotated duties. They trained the younger girls in the precise rituals of fire-keeping. They taught them how to read the flames, how to pray in the old language, how to move through the temple with the quiet grace expected of those who served the hearth of Rome. And in the evenings, when their shift was done, they would return to the atrium Vestae. They would wash their hands in the sacred spring. They would remove their veils and sit together in the courtyard, surrounded by gardens and fountains. But even then, even in the quiet of their home, they knew the fire was burning. Always burning. Just beyond the courtyard wall, in the round temple with its open roof, the flame danced on, warm and golden, eternal. And somewhere in the city, a mother whispered to her child, "See that glow? That is the heart of Rome." The night deepens, and the fire keeps burning, steady and soft. The atrium Vestae was not a prison. It was a palace. In a city where most people lived in cramped apartments stacked 5 stories high, where the streets smelled of fish sauce and smoke and unwashed bodies, the Vestals lived in luxury. Their home was enormous. A sprawling complex of rooms arranged around a central courtyard. The courtyard itself was a garden, cypress trees, rose bushes, fountains that murmured softly day and night. Statues of former Vestals stood in the colonnades, each one carved from marble, each one bearing an inscription of honor. The Vestals had private bedrooms. They had dining rooms with frescoed walls. They had a library, filled with scrolls, religious texts, yes, but also poetry, philosophy, works of history. They were among the few women in Rome encouraged to read and write. They had servants. Slaves who cooked their meals, who tended the gardens, who swept the marble floors. The Vestals themselves did not do menial labor. Their hands were for sacred work, tending the flame, performing rituals, preparing the mola salsa, the sacred salted flour used in every public sacrifice. And they had freedom. This was perhaps the most extraordinary thing about them. In a society where women were under the control of their fathers or husbands their entire lives, the Vestals answered to no man. They could own property. They could make wills. They could travel through the city without a male guardian. They could sit in reserved seats at the theater and the gladiatorial games, right beside the senators and magistrates. If a Vestal encountered a condemned criminal being led to execution, she could pardon him with a single word. Her authority in that moment was absolute. Men stepped aside when a Vestal approached. Even consuls, even generals. To bump into a Vestal by accident was unlucky. To touch one deliberately was sacrilege. They lived outside the normal rules. But they paid a price for this privilege. The vow of chastity was absolute. For 30 years, a Vestal could not marry, could not take a lover, could not even entertain the thought of it, for the gods were believed to know the secrets of the heart. If a Vestal broke her vow, if she was found guilty of incestum, the crime of unchastity, the punishment was horrific. She would be buried alive. The ritual was ancient and precise. The guilty Vestal would be dressed in funeral garments. She would be placed in a small underground chamber, barely large enough to stand in, with a bed, a lamp, and a small amount of bread and water. Then the chamber would be sealed. The earth would be mounded over it. And the city would move on, as though she had never existed. Her name would be erased from the records. Her statue would be torn down. She would become nothing. This happened rarely, perhaps a dozen times in Rome's 1,000-year history. But the threat was always there, a shadow over the privilege and the honor. Most Vestals, of course, lived and died in dignity. They served their 30 years. They retired with honor. They were given a generous pension. They could marry, if they wished, though few did. Most chose to remain in or near the atrium Vestae, living quietly, advising the younger priestesses. And when they died, they were mourned by the entire city. But in the meantime, in the long years of service, they lived in the atrium Vestae. They walked through the garden in the early morning, when the dew still clung to the roses. They sat by the fountains in the afternoon heat, reading poetry aloud to one another. They dined together in the evening, reclining on couches, eating figs and honey cakes, while the city beyond the walls grew loud with chariots and vendors and argument. And at night, they retired to their rooms. They laid down on beds softer than most Romans would ever know. They listened to the sound of water in the fountains, the rustling of leaves in the courtyard, the distant murmur of the city. And somewhere nearby, always, the fire was burning. Warm. Steady. Eternal. In the stillness, you can almost hear the water, the soft sigh of the wind through the cypress trees. The Vestals rose before dawn. The city was still dark. The streets still quiet. But inside the atrium Vestae, the day had already begun. A Vestal would wake in her small room. She would wash her face and hands in a basin of water drawn from the sacred spring. She would dress carefully, the white stola, the veil, the woolen headband tied in the ancient way. She would move slowly, deliberately. There was no rushing in the service of the goddess. Then she would walk through the quiet courtyard, past the fountains and the sleeping statues, and across the narrow lane to the temple of Vesta. Inside, the fire was already burning. Another Vestal had been on watch through the night. Now they would exchange places. A few words in low voices. A nod. And the night watch Vestal would return to the atrium to rest. The morning Vestal would kneel before the hearth. She would offer a prayer, soft words in Old Latin, barely audible. She would check the fire. Add wood if needed. Watch the flames for signs. And then, the day's work would begin. The Vestals were not idle. They had duties beyond the fire. Sacred duties that only they could perform. One of the most important was the preparation of the molla salsa, the salted flour used in every public sacrifice in Rome. This was no ordinary flour. It was made from the first ears of wheat harvested each year, ground by hand, mixed with salt drawn from special brine. The Vestals alone knew the ritual of its preparation. They alone were pure enough to touch it. They worked in a small room adjoining the temple. They ground the grain with stone mills, moving in rhythm, chanting softly. They mixed the salt in precise proportions. They blessed each batch with prayers. And then they stored it in sacred jars, sealed and marked, ready to be distributed to priests across the city for the endless round of sacrifices, daily offerings, festival rites, ceremonies of state. Without the molla salsa, no sacrifice was valid. Without the Vestals, Rome could not speak to its gods. They also prepared the suffimen, a sacred incense used in certain purification rites. They collected water from a specific spring, the Aqua Virgo, and used it in rituals of cleansing. They cared for the sacred objects kept within the temple, objects so holy that no one, not even the Vestals themselves, could look upon them directly. These objects were kept in the penus Vestae, the inner sanctum of the temple. It was said that among them was the Palladium, a small statue of Athena brought from Troy by Aeneas himself, the legendary founder of Rome. The Romans believed that as long as the Palladium remained in the temple, Rome could never fall. No one knew for certain what was in the penus. Only the Vestals Maxima, the chief Vestal, was allowed to enter. And she never spoke of what she saw. The Vestals also attended public rituals. They were present at every major festival. They walked in processions through the streets, dressed in white, their veils covering their faces. The crowds parted for them. People reached out to touch the hems of their robes, believing it brought good luck. They presided over the Vestalia, the festival of the hearth, held each June. For 1 week, the temple was open to married women, who came to offer bread and prayers for their households. The Vestals blessed them, one by one, moving through the crowd with calm grace. And they officiated at the Lupercalia, the strange and ancient rite held each February, when young men ran through the streets, striking women with strips of goatskin to promote fertility. The Vestals did not run, of course. But they stood at the altar, watching, blessing, ensuring the rite was performed correctly. In the afternoons, when the public duties were done, they returned to the atrium. They rested. They studied. They wrote letters. Vestals corresponded with senators, with generals, with other priestesses across the empire. They were advisors, confidants, keepers of secrets. And in the evenings, they gathered for the evening meal. They reclined together, speaking in low voices about the day's work, about the city's news, about the small dramas of their shared life. Then, as the sun set and the city's noise began to fade, one of them would rise. She would veil herself. She would walk back across the lane to the temple. And she would take her place before the fire, watching through the night, keeping the flame alive. The hours pass, the fire glows, the night deepens around the temple. The Vestals walked through Rome like no other women. When a Vestal left the atrium Vestae and stepped into the streets, the city transformed around her. Men moved aside. Merchants paused in their haggling. Even the lictors, those stern attendants who cleared the way for magistrates, stepped back when a Vestal approached. To obstruct a Vestal's path was not just rude. It was dangerous. It invited the wrath of the gods. If a Vestal was traveling by litter, carried by slaves through the crowded streets, the lictors would precede her, just as they did for consuls and praetors. They would call out, and the crowds would part. This was power. Quiet power. The power of the sacred. The Vestals held legal privileges that were extraordinary for women in Rome. They could own property in their own name. Most Roman women could not. Property passed from father to husband, controlled always by men. But a Vestal could buy land, own slaves, accumulate wealth. And when she retired, that wealth was hers to keep. They could make wills. They could testify in court without a guardian. Their word, their oath, carried weight that no other woman's did. And they had one privilege that was, in its way, the most remarkable of all, the power of pardon. If a Vestal, while walking through the city, happened to encounter a condemned prisoner being led to execution, she could stop the procession. She could speak a single word of clemency. And the prisoner would be freed. Not pardoned permanently necessarily. But his execution would be stayed. The matter would be reconsidered. The gods, it was believed, had intervened through their priestess. To ignore her word was to invite disaster. This rarely happened. But the fact that it could happen, the fact that these women, vowed to chastity and seclusion, held the power of life and death, spoke to something deep in the Roman imagination. The Vestals were not just priestesses. They were living symbols of Rome's relationship with the divine. They were proof that the gods watched over the city. They were the bridge between the mortal and the eternal. And they were protected by law in ways that other women, other people, were not. To harm a Vestal was sacrilege. To insult one was dangerous. To touch one improperly was unthinkable. If a man assaulted a Vestal, the punishment was death. If he merely struck her by accident, he would be required to perform elaborate rituals of purification. Even the emperors treated them with respect. Julius Caesar, who held the title of Pontifex Maximus, dined with the Vestals and sought their advice. Augustus, the first emperor, expanded their privileges and built monuments in their honor. Nero, for all his cruelties, never dared to touch them. The Vestals attended the games. They sat in reserved seats in the Colosseum, in the front rows, alongside senators and magistrates. When gladiators fought and died in the arena, when criminals were torn apart by beasts, the Vestals watched calmly, their white veils glowing in the sun. They were present at triumphs, those grand processions when victorious generals paraded through the city. They stood on the steps of the Capitoline Hill as the general ascended to offer thanks to Jupiter. They blessed the ceremony with their presence. They dined with the elite. They attended private banquets in the homes of senators. They were consulted on matters of religion, on the interpretation of omens, on the proper performance of ancient rites. And they kept secrets. Romans believed the Vestals knew things, sacred knowledge, passed down from one generation to the next. They knew the rituals that had been performed since the founding of the city. They knew the prayers that kept Rome safe. They knew what was hidden in the penus Vestae, in that dark inner chamber where no one else could go. And they never spoke of it. Not to senators. Not to emperors. Not to anyone. This silence was part of their power. People whispered about them. Wondered. Imagined. And in that space of wonder, the Vestals became something more than human. They were Rome's chosen. Rome's guardians. Rome's living link to the goddess of the hearth. And as long as they kept the flame burning, as long as they remained pure and faithful, Rome believed it could never fall. Even now, in the quiet of the night, you can imagine them, walking through the forum in their white robes, the crowds parting, the city holding its breath. And the fire, always the fire, burning on. The vow was simple and absolute. For 30 years, a Vestal must remain a virgin. No husband. No lover. No children. No physical intimacy of any kind. This was the heart of her power. This was the source of her sacredness. The Vestals were pure, Vestae, the Romans called them, and that purity was what allowed them to tend the sacred flame. It was what gave their prayers weight. It was what made them beloved of the goddess. But it was also a burden that grew heavier with each passing year. Imagine being 10 years old when you take the vow. You do not yet understand what it means. You do not know what love is, what desire is, what it feels like to be wanted. You are a child, dressed in white, handed over to the temple. By the time you are 20, you understand. You watch the city around you. You see girls your age marrying. You see them pregnant, glowing, their hands on their swollen bellies. You see them with their children, their husbands, their busy, ordinary lives. And you stand apart. You are honored, yes. Respected. Protected by law. But you are also alone. The Vestals were not supposed to feel desire. They were not supposed to think of men, of marriage, of the future that other women took for granted. They were supposed to be above such things. Beyond them. But they were human. And sometimes, they failed. When a Vestal was accused of breaking her vow, of incestum, the violation of her sacred chastity, the entire city held its breath. The trial was public. The Pontifex Maximus presided. The accused Vestal was brought before him, her face pale, her hands trembling. She was questioned. Witnesses were called. Evidence was presented, sometimes real, sometimes fabricated by enemies, sometimes nothing more than rumor and suspicion. If she was found guilty, the punishment was death. But not a quick death. Not an honorable death. The Romans believed that to spill a Vestal's blood would bring disaster upon the city. So they devised a different method. They buried her alive. The ritual was performed outside the city walls, near the Colline Gate. A small underground chamber had been prepared. It was barely large enough for a person to stand. Inside, there was a narrow bed, a lamp filled with oil, a jug of water, a loaf of bread. The condemned Vestal was dressed in funeral garments. She was led in a funeral procession through silent streets. People watched from doorways but did not speak. To speak would be to acknowledge the horror. At the chamber, she was placed inside. She did not resist. To resist would be to admit guilt. To go calmly was the only dignity left to her. The chamber was sealed. Earth was piled over it. And then, silence. The city moved on. Her name was erased from the records. Her statues were pulled down. She became a non-person, a shadow, a story whispered in the dark. Her lover, if there had been one, was flogged to death in the Forum. This happened, over the centuries, perhaps a dozen times. Perhaps fewer. The records are unclear. Some cases were certainly genuine. Others were almost certainly the result of political intrigue, of powerful men seeking to destroy rivals by accusing their daughters or sisters. But the threat was always there. Every Vestal lived with it. Every time she spoke to a man, she knew the risk. Every time she walked through the city, she knew that people were watching, judging, wondering. And yet, most of them served faithfully. Most of them kept the vow. Not because they were saints. Not because they were without desire. But because they had chosen this life, or had it chosen for them, and they believed in its purpose. They believed the flame must be kept. They believed Rome depended on them. They believed the goddess was watching. And so they endured. 30 years. 3 decades of silence. Of solitude. Of standing apart from the world. And then, if they survived, if they reached the end of their service, they were free. They could leave the atrium Vestae. They could marry, if they wished. They could live as ordinary women. But few did. Most chose to remain. They stayed in the house they had known for 30 years. They advised the younger Vestals. They performed small rituals, attended festivals, lived out their days in quiet honor. Because by then, by the time 30 years had passed, there was nowhere else to go. The temple was their home. The flame was their life. And the vow, though technically ended, had become part of them. Inseparable. Eternal. In the stillness now, you can imagine the weight of it, the long years, the silence, the flame always burning. Deep within the temple of Vesta, behind the hearth, behind the sacred fire, there was a room that no one entered. The penus Vestae. The inner sanctum. It had no windows. No decoration. Just stone walls and a locked door, and the objects kept within. What were they? What was hidden in that dark, secret space? The Romans themselves did not know. Or if they knew, they did not speak of it. The contents of the penus were the most closely guarded secret in all of Rome. Only the Vestalis Maxima, the chief of the 6 Vestals, was allowed to enter. And she told no one what she saw. But there were stories. Whispers. Legends passed down through generations. It was said that the penus contained the Palladium, the sacred statue of Athena brought from Troy by Aeneas. The statue was small, they said, carved from wood, ancient beyond measure. And it held a terrible power. As long as the Palladium remained in Rome, the city could never be conquered. It was said that the chamber also held the Penates, sacred household gods brought from Troy, objects so holy that to look upon them would bring blindness or madness or death. It was said that there were clay tablets inscribed with the oldest rituals of Rome, written in a language so old that no one could read it anymore. Spells, prayers, formulas of power. It was said that inside the penus was a small clay jar containing ashes, the ashes of Romulus, the founder of Rome himself. No one knew for certain, and the Vestals never confirmed or denied any of it. Once a year, on the Ides of March, the Vestalis Maxima would enter the chamber. She would go alone, carrying a lamp. She would close the door behind her. And for a time, perhaps an hour, perhaps longer, she would be in there with the sacred objects, performing rituals known only to her. When she emerged, her face would be calm, unreadable. She would say nothing, and the other Vestals would not ask. The secrecy was part of the sacredness. To speak of what was hidden would be to diminish it, to profane it. Some things were meant to remain in darkness. But the secrecy also gave the Vestals power. As long as no one knew what was in the penus, as long as the mystery remained, the Vestals remained indispensable. They were the only ones who could tend the sacred objects, the only ones who could perform the rituals, the only ones who stood between Rome and the wrath of the gods. And they guarded that secret jealously. There were moments, over the centuries, when the penus was opened by force. When invaders came. When the temple burned. When desperate men tried to seize the Palladium, believing it would give them power. But they never found it. Or if they did, it did not help them. The Gauls sacked Rome in 390 BC. They burned the city. They looted the temples. But the Vestals, it is said, escaped with the sacred objects hidden beneath their robes. They fled to the town of Caira and kept the flame burning there until Rome could be rebuilt. When they returned, they brought the objects back. And the penus was resealed. Centuries later, when Rome finally fell, when the barbarians poured through the gates and the empire collapsed, no one knew what became of the Palladium. Some said it was taken to Constantinople. Some said it was hidden in a Christian church, disguised as a relic of the saints. Some said it was destroyed. But the truth is, no one knows. The penus Vestae was emptied. The objects vanished into history. The secrets died with the last of the Vestals. And now, 2,000 years later, we are left with only the stories. The whispers. The tantalizing possibility that somewhere, in some forgotten corner of the ancient world, the sacred objects still exist. Hidden. Waiting. Silent. But for the Vestals who tended the temple, who walked past the penus every day, who knew that behind that locked door lay the heart of Rome's power, the mystery was simply part of their life. They did not need to see the objects. They did not need to understand them. They only needed to know that they were there. That the goddess was present. That Rome was protected. And so they tended the flame. They performed the rituals. They kept the secret. And in the darkness of the penus, the sacred objects rested, untouched, eternal. Imagine it now, the locked door, the silence, the weight of mystery settling over you like a blanket. The Vestals did not live only in the temple. They lived in the city. They were part of Rome's heartbeat. And nowhere was this more visible than during the great festivals. Rome's calendar was filled with religious observances. Sacrifices. Processions. Days of feasting and prayer. And the Vestals were present at nearly all of them, moving through the crowds in their white robes, silent, sacred, watchful. The most important festival for the Vestals was the Vestalia, held every June. For an entire week, the temple of Vesta was open to the public, or rather, to married women. Men were not allowed. This was a women's festival, a celebration of the hearth and home. On the first day, wives and mothers would come to the temple carrying offerings, honey cakes, fruit, small clay figures of household gods. They would enter barefoot, their hair unbound, their heads covered with veils. They would stand before the sacred fire and pray. They prayed for their households, for their children, for the health of their husbands, for the prosperity of their homes. And the Vestals blessed them. One by one, the women would approach. A Vestal would touch each woman's head lightly, murmuring a prayer in the old language. The woman would bow and withdraw, her eyes shining, her heart lighter. For these few days, the temple was not a place of mystery and distance. It was a place of warmth, of connection. The Vestals, so often remote and untouchable, became mothers in spirit to the women of Rome. On the last day of the Vestalia, the temple was ritually cleansed. The Vestals swept the inner chamber with brooms made of sacred twigs. The dirt and debris were gathered carefully and carried down to the Tiber River, where it was thrown into the water. This was believed to purify the temple, to wash away any impurity that might have crept in over the year. Then the temple was closed again. The penus was sealed, and the Vestals returned to their usual duties. But there were other festivals too. At the Lupercalia in February, the Vestals stood at the altar while young men ran wild through the streets, striking women with strips of goat hide. It was a strange, ancient rite, half fertility ritual, half chaos, and the Vestals presided over it with calm authority, ensuring the ritual was performed correctly, that the gods were honored. At the Perilia in April, the Vestals distributed sacred ashes and the blood of a sacrificed calf, mixed together into a paste that farmers would use to purify their flocks. This was magic, or something like it, old countryside magic wrapped in the respectability of state religion. And the Vestals were its keepers. At the Saturnalia in December, when the city erupted into feasting and gift-giving and topsy-turvy celebration, when slaves sat at their masters' tables and social norms were turned upside down, the Vestals remained apart. They did not participate in the revelry. They observed it. They blessed it. But they did not join it. They were always apart. Always watching. Always holding the line between the sacred and the profane. And yet, they were beloved. Children knew their names. Poets wrote of them. Artists painted them on the walls of wealthy homes. When a new Vestal was chosen, the city celebrated. When an old Vestal retired, the city mourned. And when a Vestal died, the entire city stopped. Her funeral was a state event. Senators attended. The emperor attended. Her body was dressed in white and laid on a bier covered with flowers. She was carried in procession through the Forum, past the temple of Vesta, past the atrium where she had lived. And as the procession passed, people wept. Not because they had known her personally. Most had not. But because she was a Vestal. Because she had kept the flame. Because she had given her life, 30 years, or 40, or 50, to the service of Rome. She was buried with honor. Her tomb was marked with an inscription listing her name, her years of service, her virtues. And her memory was preserved, at least for a time. But the flame did not stop burning. Even as her body was carried to the grave, even as the city mourned, the fire in the temple kept burning. Another Vestal was already there, tending it, praying, keeping watch. Because the city could not stop. The flame could not go out. Rome, eternal Rome, went on. And the Vestals, silent, sacred, eternal themselves, went on with it. In the stillness now, imagine the procession, the white robes, the flowers falling, the fire still burning. Not every Vestal was remembered with honor. Some were remembered with horror. The trials of the Vestals, those terrible moments when a priestess was accused of breaking her vow, were rare. But when they happened, they shook Rome to its core. One of the most famous cases occurred in 114 BC. 3 Vestals, Emilia, Licinia, and Marcia, were accused of incestum. The charges were murky. Some said they had taken lovers. Others said the accusation was political, a convenient way for certain powerful men to deflect blame for recent military disasters. Rome had suffered defeats. Crops had failed. There had been bad omens, lightning strikes, strange births, cows speaking in human voices. The people were frightened. They wanted an explanation. They wanted someone to blame. And so the Vestals were accused. The trial was long and agonizing. Witnesses were called. Slaves were tortured for testimony. The accused Vestals maintained their innocence, but their voices carried little weight against the tide of fear and suspicion. In the end, all three were found guilty. Emilia was buried alive. Licinia was buried alive. Marcia was buried alive. Their lovers, or alleged lovers, were beaten to death in the Forum. And Rome believed the gods would be appeased. But were they? The modern mind recoils at this. The idea that killing innocent women, or even guilty ones, would somehow restore divine favor seems barbaric, superstitious, cruel. And yet, for the Romans, it made perfect sense. The Vestals were the link between the city and the gods. If that link was broken, if even one Vestal violated her vow, then Rome itself was in danger. The gods had to be placated. The stain had to be cleansed. And so the accused were buried. And the city moved on. But not everyone believed. Even in ancient Rome, there were doubts. There were people who whispered that the trials were unjust. That the evidence was thin. That powerful men had used the Vestals as scapegoats. The historian Livy, writing centuries later, questioned the guilt of some of the accused. He noted the convenient timing of certain trials, how they always seemed to occur during moments of political turmoil or military disaster. And yet, no one dared speak too loudly. To defend a Vestal accused of incestum was to risk being accused oneself, of impiety, of disloyalty to Rome, of inviting the wrath of the gods. So the doubts remained quiet, whispered, hidden. But they were there. And as the centuries passed, as Rome grew more cosmopolitan, more influenced by Greek philosophy and Eastern religions, the old certainties began to crack. By the time of the emperors, the trials had become rarer. Not because the Vestals were more virtuous, but because the emperors did not want the political chaos that such trials caused. It was easier to ignore rumors, to let sleeping dogs lie. And then, Christianity arrived. The early Christians looked at the Vestals with a mixture of admiration and pity. Here were women devoted to purity, to service, to a kind of spiritual calling. And yet, they served false gods. They tended a flame that had no true power. Or so the Christians believed. As Christianity spread through the empire, the old religions began to fade. The sacrifices became less frequent. The temples fell into disrepair. The festivals lost their meaning. And the Vestals found themselves relics of a dying world. In 394 CE, the Emperor Theodosius ordered the sacred flame to be extinguished. The Temple of Vesta was closed. The Vestals were disbanded. After more than 1,000 years, the fire went out. Some of the Vestals converted to Christianity. Others simply disappeared into private life. A few, perhaps, clung to the old ways in secret, keeping small household shrines, whispering prayers to Vesta in the dark. But the order was finished. The great tradition was over. And the flame, the eternal flame that had burned for a millennium, was gone. What did those last Vestals feel, in that final moment? Did they weep? Did they rage? Did they believe, even as the temple was closed and the fire was put out, that the gods would somehow intervene? Or did they simply let go? We will never know. But we can imagine them, standing in the empty temple, watching the last embers die, knowing that an entire world was ending. And then, walking away. Into the silence. Into history. The night is deep now, the fire is gone, but the memory remains, soft and distant, like a dream. 2,000 years have passed. The Temple of Vesta is a ruin. The Atrium Vestae is a garden of broken columns and fallen statues. The sacred flame is cold. But the Vestals, in a way, the Vestals are still with us. We remember them. We study them. We wonder about them. Archaeologists dig through the ruins of the atrium, uncovering fragments of their lives, hairpins, oil lamps, bits of pottery. Historians pore over ancient texts, trying to piece together who they were, what they believed, how they lived. And writers like the one speaking to you now, tell their stories. Again and again. Trying to understand. Trying to imagine. Why do we care? Why do these ancient priestesses, these women who lived in a world so different from our own, still capture our imagination? Perhaps because they represent something universal. The tension between duty and desire. Between the individual and the collective. Between freedom and sacrifice. The Vestals had power, yes. But they paid for it with their autonomy. They had honor, but they paid for it with their lives. They were chosen as children. They had no say in the matter. And yet many of them seemed to have embraced their roles. To have found meaning in the rituals, in the flame, in the service. Or perhaps they simply made peace with it. Perhaps they had no choice but to make peace with it. We will never know what they truly felt. The Vestals left almost no written records. No diaries. No letters. Just a few inscriptions on statues, formulaic and formal, telling us nothing of their inner lives. And so we imagine. We imagine the little girl, taken from her home at age 7, trying to understand why. We imagine the young woman, 20 years into her service, standing by the fire and wondering what her life might have been. We imagine the elder Vestal, 60 years old, retired at last, sitting in the courtyard of the atrium and watching the younger priestesses, and wondering if it was worth it. We imagine. And in imagining, we honor them. Because they deserve to be remembered. Not as symbols. Not as abstractions. But as people. As women who lived and breathed and hoped and feared, just as we do. They kept the flame. For 1,000 years they kept the flame. And even though the flame is gone, even though the temple is dust, the memory remains. There is a kind of immortality in that. A small, quiet immortality. Not the immortality of gods or emperors. But the immortality of those who did their duty faithfully, day after day, year after year, until the end. The Vestals are gone. But they are not forgotten. And perhaps that is enough. And so, we come to the end of our story. The fire has gone out. The temple is silent. The Vestals have walked into history. But you are here. Safe. Warm. Resting. Let the images fade now. Let the ancient world drift away. Let yourself settle into this moment, this breath, this quiet.